So the Assassin's Creed Shadows Claws of Awaji DLC has just been released, and I was lucky enough to get my hands on it about a week early to prepare this video. Now some of you might remember that about a week before that, I played a 3-hour preview in Bordeaux. To be honest, you can forget about that video, it's outdated now, because as of me making this video, I finished the entire DLC and gone through pretty much all the content I felt was worth experiencing. So in this video, I'll share my full thoughts on whether Claws of Awaji is worth your time, especially if you did not already get it for free with a pre-order. There won't be any major story spoilers in this video. I'll be bringing up certain moments, but focusing on how I felt about them. That's the approach I want to take when talking about the story. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So the story of Claws of Awaji starts off right in your hideout, as you have just received word about a hint on where Naoe's mother Siyu is. Fast forward a bit and you're now on Awaji Island, which is the island right next to the mainland in the game. The DLC picks up right after the base game's ending. As you'll remember, the finale left things unanswered, and then the credits rolled. That's where this DLC picks up, following Naoe as she heads to Awaji in search of her mother Siyu. Now, one thing I found done quite well about Claws of Awaji is how smoothly it picks up from the end of the base game, and then it just continues on. There's no awkward time skip or any of the sort. In fact, the DLC begins exactly where Assassin's Creed Shadows left off, which makes it feel less like an optional add-on, and to me, it felt more like the natural next chapter in the story. Okay, now that we've got that out the way, let's actually dive into my thoughts because this is a review after all. So did I enjoy Claws of Awaji? The answer is yes and no. 70% yes and 30% no. I'll explain the 30% soon. I know that sounds like a cop-out, but some moments in this DLC were way better than anything in the base game. But other parts of this DLC reminded me exactly why Assassin's Creed Shadows as a game has not been sitting well with a lot of Assassin's Creed fans. And it also reminds me of why Ubisoft themselves are quite far behind the other big AAA studios when it comes to writing. Now, one very, and I mean very creative idea that Ubisoft Bordeaux implemented into this DLC is this 2.5D side-scroller type of mission. This is probably one of the most creative storytelling setups I've seen in a mainline Assassin's Creed game since like 10 or 11 years ago. They decided to finally do something innovative and it was nice to see. The mission plays out as a puppet show, and you experience it from a side perspective. The story it tells is a short but impactful tale about a woman who was loved, a brutal samurai, and also a hidden shinobi. The only real downside is that this idea was used just once in this DLC, and it was right at the start and never again. It feels like wasted potential, a phrase that I just hate saying about Assassin's Creed. Because if they had brought this back as part of side activities or even a few optional missions later on in this DLC, it could have been a standout feature of the whole expansion. If anything, this 2.5D type of mission reminds me that an Assassin's Creed Chronicles game could most definitely work if they really wanted to. Hey, who knows, maybe this was a tease of a future project they're working on. Nah, I doubt it, I'm only joking. Now moving on, I want to talk about the tone of the story, because I think it was handled pretty well to be fair. Claws of Awaji's story is not some over-the-top plot about a crazy possessed cult or anything of that sort. Instead, it feels grounded and personal, focusing on 3 main things. The first is Naoe and her mother Siyu, the second is the hold on Awaji Island, and the third is Yasuke and the so-called Templars. Now, I say so-called because the word Templar gets tossed around quite often in this entire DLC without much weight behind it. To me, it almost feels like Ubisoft Bordeaux was told to sprinkle in the Templar name just to keep longtime fans happy. In reality, the story never really felt like it was about Templars at all, even though the Senzoku Ippa are technically labelled as such. If you look past that label though, the Senzoku Ippa were written pretty well. They are the main antagonists of this entire DLC, and while they're not jaw-dropping characters, they're a clear step up compared to the Shinbakufu. Each of the 4 Senzoku Ippa members has some actual depth, and they had motives that you could understand, which gave their boss fights more weight. That's something I couldn't really say the same about for the Shinbakufu in the base game, where most encounters felt repetitive and forgettable. In Claws of Awaji, all 4 Senzoku Ippa members had final fights that felt much more carefully designed compared to the Shinbakufu in the base game. You actually understood their motives, which made each encounter feel meaningful. The fights themselves also stood out because of how differently they were set up. Each one of these 4 fights was a lot different from each other. For example, one encounter I previewed in my I Played 3 Hours video took place in an arena where the entire premise was on stealth and there was no combat whatsoever, which was a super refreshing change of pace. Another had a mechanic where the more captains you eliminated beforehand, the fewer captains there were left in protecting that specific target. That mechanic though is where my biggest issue with the DLC story comes in. The story was moving along pretty well, the pacing was fine, until it was time to go after one particular Senzoku Ippa target. At that point, the game forces you into what feels like pure padding. Instead of going straight to the boss fight, you're told to take out a shit ton of captains scattered across Awaji Island. The problem is these captains have no story relevance at all. They are just names, and they have no real purpose other than being damaged sponges. The idea behind this is that clearing out captains reduces the number of enemies backing up that Senzoku Ippa member in his final fight. Technically you can skip this step, but the fight becomes nearly impossible because of how much health and damage those extra enemies have. It ends up turning what could have been a clever setup into a frustrating roadblock, and for me it dragged the pacing of the story down quite a lot. Now, switching over to a positive note, do you remember in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, there was a mission where you would infiltrate the Cult of Cosmos hideout in disguise? Well, a similar idea is in this DLC, and that specific mission I'd say is probably one of the better missions in this game, which may not be a high bar. Even though the social stealth mechanics here in this mission are pretty basic, it's that concept of blending in while nobody realizes you're there just nails that assassin fantasy I've always liked playing. This DLC also introduced a tailing mission which surprised me. You were literally tailing a target and you had major implications if you were caught. I was caught, unfortunately, and it changed the entire premise of that specific mission, so I had to go down another route. That's where Ubisoft Bordeaux shined. They introduced story ideas that were not in the base game whatsoever, and it just felt refreshing. And this all ties back to all 4 Senzoku Ippa targets, with each of their missions being handled quite well. Moving away from the Senzoku Ippa, I want to bring up Naoe's mother Tsuyu. Before the release of this DLC, she was set up to feel like a major character in this story, but honestly her role ends up being way smaller than I expected. For most of the DLC, she's just kind of sidelined, and when she finally does something meaningful, it feels too little too late. She was quite underwhelming in this DLC, especially considering how much weight her character seemed to carry in the pre-release build-up. And to be honest, Hattori Hanzo felt the exact same. He was just as disappointing. He and Tsuyu in the base game apparently share history, right? But the DLC never explores it. In fact, in the DLC, it actively tries to ignore it. That potential dynamic is completely ignored. Instead, Hattori Hanzo is once again reduced to a background character, handing out orders and not contributing much else. It's the same issue he had in the base game, and it's very frustrating to see it repeated here. You would not expect this Hattori Hanzo from Assassin's Creed Memories to be turned into this in a fully mainline game. That's one of my main problems with the story. Characters like Tsuyu and Hattori Hanzo should have played a much bigger role. Now I get it, the focus is supposed to be on Naoe and Yasuke, but adding more depth and involvement for these side characters would have made the story feel a lot more refreshing. Another problem I had with this DLC is the complete absence of a first civilization plot. Going into it, I'm not ashamed to say that I expected the regalia boxes to tie together as some sort of ezio artifact, but that never happened. Now it's confirmed, neither the base game nor this DLC has anything to do with the ezio, and that's disappointing. For me, there are 3 narrative pillars that every single Assassin's Creed game should have: a meaningful plot around the Assassins and Templars, a modern day component, and something tied to the first civilization. This DLC only halfway delivers on the first one, and that's being generous. The modern day is completely missing in this DLC, which is frustrating because if you compare it to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the DLC in that game still managed to feature the modern day. And the first civilization angle is absent too. The regalia boxes end up being nothing more than generic objects with no magical power or anything. There's no real value to the player or the overarching lore. So yeah, as for the story overall, I'd say that 70% of it was genuinely good. It had creative moments, surprising twists, and a pacing that worked very well. But you see, that last stretch dropped the ball. The forced padding of hunting down captains across Awaji Island to progress was tedious as hell, and the final ending felt anticlimactic. I'd rate it as starting out around a 7.5 out of 10, but by the time I finished it, it dropped to about a 6 out of 10. Okay, let's move on to Awaji Island itself. Back in my 3-hour preview video, I mentioned I had only seen about 30% of the map. Now that I finished the DLC and explored pretty much the whole island, I'd say I'm pleased in a lot of ways but also disappointed in some aspects. Let's start with the positives. The map size is reasonable. It's an island, so I wasn't expecting anything massive, and the scale works fine for the story being told. What stood out more though was the atmosphere of exploration. Since the plot has you constantly hunted by the Senzoku Ippa, exploring Awaji felt harsher and less forgiving than the base game. For example, following a path was not as simple as letting your horse run straight to your destination. Traps like tripwires were scattered everywhere. If you triggered them, you'd be poisoned and swarmed by shinobi under the Senzoku Ippa's command. It could get messy fast, but that's also what made it interesting. You're the hunted, remember, not the hunter. I also liked how these traps tied back to story progression. Clearing them out required advancing the main plot, so I thought the idea was interesting. The same goes for a new mechanic called the danger zone. Here, sending out scouts could backfire, triggering a red circle that made the area extremely dangerous. Powerful captains would show up, and they were tanky enough to overwhelm Naoe very fast. To be honest, I found it best to let Yasuke handle those fights because Naoe, oh boy, Naoe is not suited for big ass enemies like that. On the more negative side, unfortunately, exploration did get frustrating at times. Being hunted constantly might sound fun on paper. It's a thrill, right? But after a while it becomes tiring. You could be climbing a mountain or be in the middle of nowhere and suddenly shinobi are just there chilling in bushes waiting for you, or maybe some enemies are spawning in out of nowhere. I'd say around half of my exploration ended up in combat because of this. Thankfully, as you progress the main story and take down certain Senzoku Ippa members, these interruptions start to disappear, but early on it really drags down the pacing. Side content is another weak point. Lower your expectations a lot because most of it is filler. In fact, maybe all of it is filler. Out of everything I tried, there was only one side quest that stood out, and that was a retired Ashigaru who challenges Yasuke to see if he still has his strength. The fight itself was quite fun, but it was overly damage spongy, though the reward made it feel worth finishing. Beyond that, the rest of the side content was forgettable. There's a fetch quest that's tied to Junjiro that I thought was flat out terrible, and all the other activities from the base game like Kujikiri, Kata, Shrine Praying, all of that is straight copy pasted from the base game with no changes at all. So yeah, overall the side content is just padding. It's disappointing, but maybe not surprising given that this is mainly a story focused DLC. I think aside from the first 70% of the story, I thought a big highlight of this DLC was the combat, because when I played only 3 hours last week, I said the bow staff was the highlight. But little did I know, there's a lot of new additions relating to combat and it impressed me a lot. The highlight for me is without a doubt Naoe's brand new weapon, the bow staff. It's easily my favorite weapon in the game right now. Unlike her other weapons which focus on raw damage or speed, the bow staff is literally all about control. You're knocking enemies back, you're tripping them up, and you're creating space instead of just swinging for big damage. It makes fights feel a lot more tactical, and it changes how you approach groups compared to before. Now, I'm not gonna lie, after using it for a while, going back to her older loadouts felt kind of flat. The bow staff comes with its own skill tree and new abilities, but the main difference is how it handles posture attacks. On top of your regular light and heavy swings, you can chain in posture moves, high, medium and low, each serving a different purpose. High posture stuns enemies and interrupts their moves. Medium posture knocks enemies back to give you space. And low posture, this one became my go-to. You sweep enemies to the ground so you can follow up with ground strikes. The best part is that just mashing attacks with this weapon does not really go anywhere. To get the most of it, you have to mix and match posture attacks, and that makes combat feel more rewarding and a lot more thoughtful than any other weapon. On top of that, there are 3 new specific bow staff abilities. All of them are worth using. Wind Step increases the staff's speed, reach and impact, making it amazing for crowd control. Though, as I said before in my last video, it feels a little broken because the effect lasts for so long. Grab and Throw is the flashiest. You hook an enemy with the staff, slam them into another and deal around 70% ability damage. And then there's Flurry of Blows, which is 5 rapid hits in a row, each dealing about 20% damage. But Yasuke did not get left out either. He actually got new skills for all of his weapons, which I thought was a great touch. In total, it's 5 new skills and 10 upgrades. Some of them make his combat flow way smoother. And to be honest, it was refreshing to have new options for him, instead of feeling like he was stuck with the same kit from the base game. I'd say overall Yasuke benefited a lot, since these upgrades make his already powerful playstyle even more versatile. So yeah, between Naoe's bow staff and Yasuke's new abilities, the combat in Close of Awaji feels refreshed in a way that actually surprised me. Even though enemies can still feel a bit spongy at times, these new mechanics makes fights feel more fun. and for me they were one of the strongest parts of the DLC. So after finishing everything Claws of Awaji has to offer, what do I think? Is it good? Is it bad? Well, let me tell you. I'd say this DLC is a bit of a mixed bag, but it leans more on the positive side thanks to a few highlights. The story for the first 70% had me hooked, but the last chunk of the story really dropped the ball. The forced padding with captains across Awaji Island and the anticlimactic ending brought it down quite hard. Characters like Siyu and Hattori Hanzo also felt wasted, which was disappointing considering how important they were set up to be. And the complete lack of First Civilization connections or modern day storylines is a reminder that Ubisoft is still ignoring two of the core pillars of what makes Assassin's Creed Assassin's Creed. Awaji Island itself was not that bad, it was decent. The traps and ambushes sold the idea of being hunted, but after a while it got annoying, with random enemies spawning in constantly. And as for side content, well, that's pretty much filler, with one or two exceptions. The saving grace here is combat. Naoe's new bow staff is my favorite weapon in the game now, thanks to posture attacks and 3 new fun abilities that made fights feel more tactical. The same goes for Yasuke, who also benefited from combat with his new skills across all his weapons. Overall, I'd place this DLC a solid maybe 6.8 out of 10. It had some great ideas, but there were too many missed opportunities.